His mother warned me.
Hey there everyone, I am Jeff. This is Tabletop Toolbox, and today we're going to put the pedal to the metal and apex our corners in Joyride Survival of the Fastest, a chaotic yet tactical racing destruction derby themed game for 2 to 4 players by Rebellion Unplugged. Now first off, what you're seeing here next to me is Joyride Turbo. This was a pledge level during the Kickstarter campaign that includes the base game, Survival of the Fastest, but also all of the expansions and additional content. So just note that what you see here and what you may find in retail outlets will look a little different, and I intend on using all base game content for the majority of this video. Racing games these days have become a dime a dozen, and in my opinion, very few of them have managed to make me feel like I had any agency, any real control over my vehicle, or any flexibility I could work within to try and get a leg up on my competitors. Racing is a sport that takes incredible skill, physical endurance, lightning fast reflexes, and incredible familiarity with the vehicle you're cocooned within as you hurtle around the asphalt at triple-digit speeds. All of these attributes are, understandably, near impossible to translate into a tabletop analog made of plastic and paper, and as a result, most of these games have reverted to luck-driven mechanisms at the hands of dice or cards to replicate that tension of a fast-paced race, but also meaning that any lead you have over your opponents is likely attributed more to luck than any real skill you may have employed. Now, what does Joyride use to provide agency to players? Right. So right now you might be thinking what I was thinking when I first started to unpack this box, but let me take some time now to tell you why these dice aren't a bad thing. First, I'll show you the components players have to work with, like these wildly illustrated player boards, a gear shift indicator, 5 wooden dice in their player color, a few ability tokens they can use, and these chunky, colorful wooden car tokens, which frankly look fantastic, but I'll admit don't lend themselves to dynamic cinematography. Players will be racing on this large, busy, colorful board, which, unlike most racing games, doesn't represent an actual track. If anything, this looks more like a hex-based dudes on a map board with no predetermined corners or straightaways. There are a few pre-printed obstacles scattered about, but beyond that, players can create their own circuits on these boards using these checkpoint markers. These establish an imaginary line between obstacles or the edge of the board, which players must touch with at least one end of their vehicle before moving on to the next checkpoint. These checkpoint markers are also two-sided, and this side can be used to award players with equipment tokens like missiles, mines, or oil slicks, turning this game into a grown-up version of Mario Kart if players prefer. Now, I'll come back to those in a little bit, but I'd like to quickly run through the simple turn structure of Joyride. Each player's turn consists of 5 steps. The first of which, hilariously, is making sure you're ready for your turn, as all you need to do here is make sure that you have a number of dice on the rearview mirror of your player board equal to your current gear shift position. Step 2 is where the rubber meets the road, as you'll then decide how many of your dice you want to lock, which you'll do by placing them on the lock positions of your player board, maintaining their current value. You'll start with 4 slots, but they can become permanently damaged during a race. With the dice locked, you'll move your vehicle forward that number of spaces. Step 3 is, well, essentially the best part of every film in the Fast and Furious franchise. That's right, shift baby shift. In step 3, you'll choose to maintain your current gear or change your gear position by 1. If you shift up, you'll add one of your dice to the rearview mirror of your player board. If you shift down, you'll remove a die, but only if you have dice to remove. You can never shift below the number of locked dice on your player board. You can also shift down 2 gears, but taking a permanent damage to your vehicle in the process. Damage tokens are placed on your locked dice spaces, top 3 gear spaces, or equipment spaces on your board, blocking those spaces for the rest of the race. In step 4, you'll roll any dice left on the rearview mirror of your player board, and again, move that number of spaces on the board. The 5th and final step of your turn is simply placing all of your dice back on the rearview mirror, maintaining their current values, and if you do this correctly, then step 1 of your next turn is already done. Now you'll notice that at no point have I mentioned turning in this summary of the rules, and that's because turning in Joyride is the one confusing rule in the entire game. It's the only rule that includes an if-or statement, but before I explain it, let me first explain what a turn looks like in Joyride. Simply put, when you turn, the front half of your vehicle will move forward to a space 60 degrees to the side of its current space, and the back half of your vehicle will move to the space the front of your vehicle was occupying. That first space of movement must be the first movement on either the locking or rolling phase of your turn. So you can't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for example. In addition, and this is the confusing part of this rule, you can only turn once during your turn, either during the lock phase or the roll phase, unless you're in second gear during the roll phase, in which case you can begin your movement with a turn, regardless of whether or not you turned in the lock phase. This of course represents the maneuverability of a vehicle at lower speeds, but in board game space, this slightly wonky rule engenders the tactical nature of this game, that ability to move a precise number of spaces into a corner, or planning to take a very tight corner at low speeds, gives players far more control than this pile of dice might otherwise suggest. Yes, you will still roll these dice, and yes, sometimes those rolls will produce negative results. But I should note that each of these dice are only numbered 1 to 3, which means you'll often know exactly where your car could end up and choose how much risk you want to take. And it's that aspect of Joyride that can create those epic stand-up moments when things go just right or just wrong for a player. So I've kind of already summed up what I think about this game, but that doesn't mean this party has to end just yet. I'd like to show you a little bit more about the Destruction Derby-esque Mario Kart-like aspects of this game, because unlike other popular racing games, a car in your way doesn't necessarily have to stay in your way. Striking a car from the side will pivot that car out of your way, potentially leaving them in quite the pickle on their next turn. Hitting a car from behind lets you push it, having your remaining movement. In the unlikely event of a head-on collision, the owner of the stationary vehicle can decide whether they want to be pushed backwards or stand firm, in which case both players will take a damage token and remove all dice and their gear shift indicator from their player boards. They'll skip the lock step of their next turn before shifting into first gear and rolling 1 die. The same thing happens, by the way, if a player hits an obstruction or the edge of the track. I'll also tell you a bit about these ability tokens that players can use on their turns. Each car in the game comes with 3 abilities specific to the vehicle, but the game also includes 3 generic abilities for all players to use instead, if you prefer. Each ability can be triggered during a specific phase of a player's turn, and they can provide a wide variety of benefits like moving additional spaces, shifting additional gears, perhaps without taking damage, or allowing players to have even more steering control during movement. Now, most of these abilities are consumed when they're used, but players might get to refresh some of their abilities at the end of each lap, depending on their current place in the lineup. Speaking of placement, the turn order from round to round is determined by each player's current gear selection, with highest gears going first in the next round. This really allows for some clever play. Maybe you can stay in a higher gear, but intentionally lock some 1-value dice on your player board. This would let you go a shorter distance in a higher gear, maybe just enough to exit a tricky corner, but then let you explode down the track in your next turn. There are also those equipment items I talked about. These can also be dropped, fired, or activated during specific phases of your turn. I'm not going to cover these in detail because, frankly, I can't remember which ones came in the base game versus the expansions, but there are items such as nitrous, missiles, oil slicks, even drone attacks, and a good bit more. You can choose to place these items around the track as a power-up of sorts, or you can let players gain them when crossing those checkpoints, as I mentioned earlier. You can also just leave them out if you want your game to be a little less mean or random. Personally, I find some of them to be a bit more useful and even more hilarious than others, but of course, each race ends up being a bit unique as it is. And on that note, I'll just very quickly chat about the expansions available for Joyride, as they simply serve to drastically amplify the variability of the game. You'll get more cars with more unique abilities. I quite like the EV car with its fairly unique power drain feature. You'll get more items to play with, more 2-sided boards to race around on, and even these bridge tiles which you can use to create massive tracks across multiple boards. I'll admit that I've been a bit spoiled by having this additional content available from my very first game. My first race utilized that EV car, so I don't know how repetitive the base game on its own might feel after a few plays. Luckily, you can still buy this Turbo Edition on the Rebellion Unplugged website. Okay, summary time. I have always had a bit of a soft spot for the automotive industry and auto racing, but it is honestly a genre of game I tend to play the least because games in this category often take way too long to set up and either have too few rules and too much luck, or too many rules and still too much luck. And I want to be clear, there's still a fair amount of luck in Joyride. Sometimes you have to throw the car into a corner and hope it sticks, or mash the gas down a straightaway and hope to maintain control. But you can mitigate that luck, manage that luck, or even avoid it if you really wanted to, at perhaps the cost of a little maneuverability. And that, frankly, is what I love about Joyride the most. These player boards truly mean something, and their compartmentalization of your dice, items, and gear selection really emphasize the decisions available to you on your turn. These tracks challenge you to find the optimal racing line, but provide enough space to, hopefully, absorb a few mishaps. I was even worried that a full 4-player count on the smaller 4-tile racing board might be too tight and chaotic, but honestly, even in these tighter tracks, you should have enough space to employ a decent mix of precision and reckless abandon in each lap of Joyride. But I would be remiss if I didn't share just a few quibbles with the overall design, and I'll start at the beginning of each race, where players roll 2 dice to make their initial movement off the starting line. In some of those tighter layouts, I've seen that first roll really hose a player, especially when they've managed to roll 2 3s, almost immediately shoving themselves up against a wall or taking them outside of the intended circuit path. You could probably address this with a simple house rule, but I'll let you tackle that on your own. Secondly, because of the control that players have here with the dual movement actions on their turn and the wide open aspect of these boards, a player could get a bit lost while calculating their turn, trying different values of locked dice, changing their turning point, etc. And this can also result in them forgetting where they started their turn from in the first place. Personally, I'm considering a little ghost card piece that will help them track their starting location, but also maybe a turn timer, since in reality you don't have a lot of time to plan for that upcoming corner when you're doing a $1.20. And on that note, this game can be a bit punishing if you make a big enough mistake. Bumping into a wall and losing your forward momentum can certainly be a drag, but suddenly finding yourself on the wrong side of an obstruction or flat out facing the wrong direction in 4th gear is a nearly guaranteed DNF. While there are rules to allow for reversing in 1st gear and turning in reverse, it simply takes a lot of turns to get yourself back to where you need to be, and the likelihood of catching up is pretty slim. And finally, I do also know that there's a bit of controversy out there regarding how similar Joyride is to the 2008 game Powerboats and 2018 game of Power Ships, both by the same Dutch designer and publisher. I found out about this while preparing this review, and I did read the rulebook to Powerboats. There are definitely some pretty similar concepts between the two, with differences in movement, collisions, power-ups, and damage, just to name a few. Unfortunately, the issue here is a moral one at best, as the concept of a game cannot be copyrighted. Think about it. Worker placement is a popular gaming mechanism, not the title of an official patent. More unfortunately, this is something we're going to see more of in this industry because, let's face it, there's only so much you can do with paper and cardboard. I could throw a rubber ball in this room and probably hit a few games with similar rules or mechanisms. Now, Rebellion Unplugged probably could have gotten out in front of this a little better than they did, but like it or not, they didn't actually do anything wrong. Right now, this game is out. It's sitting right here. I had never heard of those other titles. I like this one quite a bit, and I'm going to have to leave it at that. Joyride has enough strategic depth to be clever and calculative, with just enough room left for some chaos and mishaps. And while perhaps this ain't no 10-second race, you could always tell the winner,
dude, I almost had you.
Brian, still the buster. Cheers. Literally, you're just going to hold that shot and you're looking at me with this look of confusing on your face. That's the whole shot. So let's do this first.
So just another day.
Just... That's on camera. Players can create their own circuits on this track using these tokens that I misplaced off camera. Protect yourself from mayhem, like me.